So now that everyone has been refreshed, we're moving to panel 2. So instead of just talking about EU-China relations, we're going to talk about EU-China-US relations, I guess. Strategic interactions in a shifting world. Well, good luck to the panelists. So for those who don't know me, I'm Patrick Leblond. I'm a professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. So thank you to Karina for inviting me to chair this panel. We have 4 panelists, 3 who are here in person and 1 who is online. So we have Jeremy Paultiel, who is now, if I'm not mistaken, I should look again, I think you're emeritus. Yes, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Carleton University. He is the author of The Empire's New Clothes, Cultural Particularism and Universality in China's Rise to Global Status. Then we have Charles Burton, who is a senior fellow at Synopsis, specializing in China's domestic affairs and international relations, with extensive publication on these topics. He's also a former Canadian diplomat. Can you tell us quickly, Charles, what Synopsis is?
It's based out of Charles University in Prague. It works on China.
Okay, all right.
And, the others are from other countries too, but largely Anna Marie Brady and Didi Tatlow and so on.
Okay, thank you very much. Just thought that I wouldn't.
Publications. Look them up on the internet, synopsis.cz.
Perfect. Then we have Kristen Hopewell to the far right, obviously physically far right, not politically. I'd like to specify. Just making sure no one gets confused. She is professor and Canada Research Chair in Global Policy in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia. She is also the director of the Liu Institute of Global Issues and the former director of the Center for Chinese Research. Yes, she's a former Wilson China Fellow at the Wilson, the now defunct Wilson Center, unfortunately, and I guess this will be part of our conversation. Finally, online, we have Minyi, who is a professor of international relations at the Party School of Global Studies at Boston University, and she previously served as director of East Asian Studies at the university. And there we go. Okay, I'll stop here. You have all the bios. So great panel, great panelists, lots to talk about. So I will now give Jeremy the podium so he can talk to us about the enemy's enemy I can't befriend, the dilemma for the EU and Canada of Sino-American rivalry under MAGA.
Yeah. So yeah, as I was trying to think through this, and I often think as I keep going along. So in some ways my PowerPoints and my talking points will have evolved since then. But I wanted to think about a conceptual approach to this triangular strategic relationship. And when I did that, I thought, look, and the geoeconomics and geopolitics are not always commensurable. The essence of trade is complementarity. The essence of strategic relations in the military sense are arithmetic, addition and subtraction. Investment is also complementarity. I mean, in the complementarity of trade is simply leveraging complementary goods to economic advantage. In investment, it's leveraging trade and leveraging technology and capital with local labor for a profit. So you have these other two incommensurable elements that are now at play in this triangular strategic relationship, and this will play out. Some of my colleagues. Wenran Jiang, for example, now talks about this moment as hegemonic tradition. I will talk about hegemony for a second, but I don't think the hegemonic transition gives us enough clarity on policy choices. It tells you what the framework is in general, but it doesn't tell you what the policy choices of leaders within each are at the same time. Since the end of the Cold War, China has been the greatest beneficiary of the globalized system of liberalized trade and investment. In the process, as it have lifted more people out of poverty more rapidly than anywhere in history of the world, and has also greatly accelerated growth worldwide. The process of globalization has also skewed the returns to labor and capital in the developed world in favor of the owners of capital, and has built China into the world's workshop, approaching, some people say, 1/3, other people say almost 50% of the world's manufacturing capacity. It has also aided rather than eroded the entrenchment of the Chinese Communist Party. Many people hope that this process of globalization would erode the power, but has entrenched the Communist Party in power and helped it erect a formidable national security state, which has promoted a military buildup that has enabled China to confront the US as a peer competitor. The emergence of China as a peer competitor in a broad spectrum of capabilities, along with the decline of US manufacturing and the attendant pressures on working class America, is the backdrop of the emergence of Trump and the MAGA movement, which has as its core aim the rollback of globalization and the leveraging of the US dollar and the US market to promote exclusively US interests. Russia under Putin has exploited Sino-American rivalry and the retrenchment of the US interest to promote its own efforts to rebuild the imperial ambitions over its near abroad. This has placed the EU in a dilemma, and in the process also of the things before, has cast Canada adrift. For a long time, the drag of a weak EU growth on the euro promoted German manufactured exports to China, but that trend has now reversed. Europe confronts excess manufacturing in China, combined with the challenge of both China and the US as superior competitors into technological innovation. While China, unlike the US, pays lip service to multilateralism and open trade, it makes no secret of its competitive drive to the top and uses the leverage open to an authoritarian state with substantial state ownership in finance to direct capital to its preferred frontier. It also shields Russia from the impact of sanctions over its invasion of Ukraine by providing an alternative market for energy exports and crucial technological inputs. Russia and China make no secret of their alignment to preempt the reemergence of a global liberal hegemony. With or without US leadership, Canada, which clung to the liberal alignment of the Biden administration, has been sorely stung by its abandonment under Trump. Europe is equally bewildered and disoriented. As John Eikenberry has written, the post-war settlement saw US hegemony and US power legitimated through an open, inclusive order underpinned by international institutions supported by US might. The US became the indispensable power where US soft and hard power complemented each other in securing allies and gaining legitimacy, while the power of US innovation and the dynamism of its domestic market underpinned global economic expansion. Through the Marshall Plan, the liberal order was embedded in the EU, and the same core values of liberalism, free trade, markets, and multilateralism, and the rule of law were baked into its institutions. If we look at the lists, every one of the core values that have sustained the legitimacy of US hegemony is now hollowed out by the MAGA agenda. China under Xi Jinping, CCP, is a national security state, which defines regime security as national security. Apart from safeguarding the CCP as China's ruling organization, the CCP is obsessed with maintaining the regime's legitimacy domestically and internationally by safeguarding the material welfare of the Chinese population and by enhancing China's status globally alongside the projection of China's governance system as normative and legitimate. and as a model for development worldwide, especially in the post-colonial global South. China is not interested in abolishing the liberal order, nor in opposing liberalism worldwide. Instead, it is intent on relativizing liberalism as a Eurocentric and its hegemony as a relic of imperialism. Its ambition is limited to safeguard its global status within a system of sovereign states undergirded by the UN system within a global market order. It sees itself as competitor with liberalism, but in a positive sum, not a zero-sum competition. Now, while China's market society is by no means under totalitarian control as it was in the days of Mao Zedong, organized political expression of any kind remains the purview of the Communist Party. Now, and here I want to talk about the dilemma of what happens when China was allowed into the WTO. The problem is that the GATT rules and WTO rules really depend on a system of rule of law. And although China subscribes to the rules of the WTO, and it does, the Chinese system of strategic control under the Communist Party undermines the rule of law domestically and really hollows out the idea of national treatment. China subscribes to national, and there are ways, and you can win court cases in China. Foreign companies do win court cases in China, sometimes against local competitors. But raison d'etat always prevails in China, and that has been the fundamental imbalance in China's WTO membership. Labeling China as a non-market economy in the WTO system is a partial but inadequate reflection of that reality. It really doesn't capture it. The basic economic policy under Xi Jinping has remained consistent. It is guided by a sustained trajectory to advance manufacturing through high investment. The stress on manufacturing is in some ways a residual Marxist prejudice. Even in the face of secular change, Xi Jinping has resisted a change to consumption-led market economy and has at best taken an ambivalent, paternalistic approach to the private sector without full guarantees of the rights of private property. Its approach to the private sector as to foreign investment is instrumental and contingent. Nonetheless, there is real commitment to an open trading system, international competitiveness, and the market mechanism of supply and demand as a means of determining prices and factors of production. China's basic position with respect to the MAGA agenda was outlined explicitly by China's foreign policy chief, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, at the most recent Munich Security Conference. In February, China, he maintained, was the pillar of stability and a true supporter of the rules-based multilateral order. China's claim to uphold the multilateral trading system centered on the WTO both hold some truth and invite skepticism. China does not challenge the institution, nor does it obstruct their working, as the US has done, by refusing to send judges. China challenges the spirit of those institutions domestically, while working internationally to reinterpret the role and processes of those institutions in line with its interests, largely working with the Global South and the BRICS inside the G20 and UN-affiliated institutions. So it does it within the framework, but it does it to sort of change it inside. China's championing true multilateralism where the modifier is meant to exclude alliance systems like NATO, which China views as illegitimate Cold War institution. This is at the security level. China challenges the EU, most of whose members belong to NATO, as well as in terms of the underlying process and methods of multilateralism rooted in liberal norms. So then the point I'm trying to make here is simply that the EU is constitutionally liberal and multilateral. It cannot change that identity. And it has to uphold those systems because without them, the EU would not exist. So it's not a question of values versus thing. It's constitutional to EU. And China may want the EU as a as a strategic autonomy, but strategic autonomy for EU can only be within a liberal multilateral order, and that is something which China has a very different point. Now there are interest and value conflicts over Ukraine, and that is basically because Ukraine is in Europe, and because of the value differences that underline the Putin's aggression in Ukraine. But there are also problems of security in economics, and that is to say that given the Ukraine conflict, that has exacerbated Europe's security dilemma in relation to China with regard to technology. China has made no secret of the fact that it wants to be self-sufficient in all levels of high-level technology. That means no complementarity, really, over the long term, over high technology. It's closer to a zero-sum competition. So that, in the EV question, that's at the heart of the EV question. In a world where nuance was possible, which is not the world we live in today, you could have complementarity in technology and, for example, encourage Chinese investment of its superior EV technology in Europe or in Canada. But we don't live in a nuanced world. And although we may be searching for nuanced policies, they're not available to us because the United States will punish anyone who cooperates in technology with China. They will punish it through trade and every other method that they can. And so the dilemma for Europe is a difficult one. Although you can have short-term transactional agreements with China, the long-term prospect is competitive. And at the same time, you are embedded in a system led by the United States, which you cannot really become part of. And this is the same, depart from, and that's the same for Canada as well. So it's a true dilemma. You can have short-term agreements, but the long-term is gloomy. And the enemy's enemy can't be your friend in either sense. You have a predatory United States on the one hand, and you have a China that's driving for dominance at the other limit, and which is aligned in an anti-liberal alignment with Putin's Russia. So it's a difficult dilemma, which the EU will have a difficult. There may be areas of short-term agreement, but the long term for the Europeans is one more of a competitive, and where you don't know what to do with a predatory United States, nor does Canada. But the dilemma is existential and can't be removed by nuanced policies. I'll stop here.
Okay. That was uplifting. Charles Burton, if you want to please come to the podium. Charles will speak to the impact of recent U.S. foreign policy doctrine transformation on China-EU relations. So
Jeremy's?
let's see if he's more optimistic than Jeremy.
I'm not. Maybe some of you want to take a break now.
If you want to leave.
Okay. How do I change the thing? Oh, there we go. Okay. So, the U.S. is evidently ceasing to be the guardian of world democracies and transnational organizations designed to assure global peace and promote justice and prosperity. At least that was what they're intended for. So, U.S. doesn't like NATO, U.S. undermining and withdrawing from the UN, U.S. Has made the WTO essentially meaningless. And Trump's aggressive abandonment of America's long-term alliances and his unpredictable and erratic approach to international relations is making it very challenging for Europe to feel confident that any future treaty relationships with the United States can be relied upon. There we go. Moreover, the United States is transforming from protector to predator of Europe and the world. The Trump administration may leverage access to the U.S. market to gain compliance with U.S. geostrategic agendas. This would include, can we do something different from the United States on Russia, Ukraine, Gaza, Greenland, China, Taiwan? Which European country will be rising to the defense of Canada if Trump decides to take steps towards his 51st state agenda for this country? And after all, his tariffs are justified by his assertion that the U.S. has been looted, pillaged, raped, and plundered by parasitical allies that it has been stupidly subsidizing in past U.S. administrations. I think that more or less a quote, maybe a paraphrase. This sort of assertion compares unfavorably to the assurances that we get from China that China's international relations are based on win-win cooperation, or the Chinese propaganda that Beijing actually cares about the well-being of people in nations outside China. U.S. cancels all foreign aid. China offers the Belt and Road. Xi Jinping appears to have a sort of clenched jaw grin here as Mr. Xi's Marxist dialectical approach sees the old world order as collapsing in fulfillment of China's ambition to become the new global hegemon. In 2012, Xi Jinping declared his Chinese dream for China. It's a foreign policy vision, and I quote, "Realizing the great renewal of the Chinese nation is the greatest dream for the Chinese nation in modern history. According to this scheme, by the year 2050, China would dominate the world through a framework of international relations that Mr. Xi dubs the community of the common destiny with mankind, or for mankind." So he set this out in one of his 3.5-hour-long reports to the National People's Congress in 2017. And it came up at about 173-minute mark, where he talks about adhering to the path of peaceful development and constructing a community of common destiny with mankind. And it's based on the presumption that the United States is rapidly losing its power and charismatic prestige as a leader and shaper of global affairs, and of China regaining its rightful and traditional civilizational role as the central focus of world politics and economics, as part and parcel of the dynamic of the rise and fall of the great empires from ancient to modern times. And China's mega-ambitious Belt and Road global infrastructure program has all of its international pipelines, shipping routes, railways, and highways ultimately leading to Beijing. So this is based on the idea that China's civilization is ancient and great, that China was weakened and is victimized by amoral Western forces, and that China will rise again and set things to rights. It's not a completely untypical Marxist idea, because if you look here at E.H. Carr, he writes that theories of international morality are always the product of a dominant group which identifies itself with the community as a whole. Theories of international morality are the product of dominant nations or groups of nations for the past 100 years, and he's talking about 1939, and more, especially since 1918, the English-speaking peoples have formed the dominant group in the world, and current theories of international morality have been designed to perpetuate their supremacy. Mr. Xi couldn't have said it better himself, I think. So we're really looking at a situation where, as Chairman Mao said, China believes that the east wind will prevail over the west wind. And Xi Jinping has been quoting this statement by Chairman Mao. And I think that we can see the folly of MAGA, as Jeremy talks about, enabling a dramatic disintegration of America's global superpower status, is fast-tracking a transition that, would be characterized, if Mr. Xi gets his way, and that's certainly not certain, of Mandarin replacing English as the lingua franca of future global affairs. Kevin Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister and Australia's current ambassador in Washington, has said that Xi and the senior Chinese leadership's view is summarized in Xi Jinping's aphorism, "The rise of the East and the decline of the West," and Xi's assertion that we are now living in a period of great historical change, the likes of which we have not seen in 100 years. And this is not a new idea from Mr. Trump in terms of the Americans' awareness of this reality. You can see President Biden's Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, I don't know where he is, but probably hiding out from the law somewhere if Mr. Trump's scheme is as we imagine it would be. But even as President Putin's war continues, we remain focused on the most serious long-term challenge to the international order, and that's posed by the People's Republic of China. China is the only country with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. Beijing's vision would move us away from the universal values that have sustained so much of the world's progress over the past 75 years. So well said, Mr. Blinken, and he said that in 2022. But Mr. Xi's answer to this is there is nothing to worry about. China should be portrayed as a civilized country, featuring rich history, ethnic unity, some would question that, and cultural diversity, again questionable, and as an oriental power with good government, developed economy, cultural prosperity, national unity, and beautiful mountains and rivers. No argument about the mountains and rivers. China should also be marked as a responsible country that advocates peaceful and common development, safeguards international justice, and makes contributions to humanity, and as a socialist country which is open, amicable, promising, and vibrant. Worthy of discussion, I would say most of that is what is these days characterized as disinformation. Now, here's an article in the South China Morning Post, which used to be a pillar of British colonial Hong Kong propaganda and is now what one might describe as Chinese Communist Party adjacent. And its article says that European Union leaders are planning to travel to China for a summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping in late July, according to 5 people familiar with the arrangement. I don't know who those 5 people are. The plan suggests a second successive EU-China summit would be held in the Chinese capital, despite the fact that the location is supposed to rotate. However, with Xi reluctant to make the trip to Brussels, it's understood that European Council President Antonio Costa and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen have accepted that they must travel to Beijing if they want face time with the Chinese leader. This is what China always wants, the foreigners to come to China and basically kowtow, if possible, in the Great Hall of the People. No date has been confirmed with the Chinese side, but EU leaders' willingness to make the trip indicates a serious effort to re-engage with Beijing at a time when the bloc's relationship with the United States has effectively collapsed. U.S. President Donald Trump's return to the White House has seen him impose tariffs on EU goods, which he has performed while he's performed a dramatic geopolitical volte-face on Ukraine, leaving the Europeans to consider him on the side of invading Russia in the 3-year war. Well, let's bear in mind this is the South China Morning Post, not the Washington Post, so, you know, and I haven't heard from any other source about this visit by Europeans to show their respect to the greater Chinese Middle Kingdom, but anyway, may well happen, and by that time, maybe it will become more necessary that it happens. The Chinese perspective is that Europe has been weakened by decades of its complacent dependency on the U.S. for defense. I guess the NATO allies thought they were thrifty in stiffing, the European, the Americans, because the Washington would pick up the slack. But, you know, there is no reciprocal fairness, no goodwill in Europe's engagement with the Trump regime. And so this is where China will come in, dangling its version of a light line. Let's hit the reset button, put aside our past differences, generate economic benefits for all, and Europe will be desperate for enhanced access to China's vast market. China's always promising more access to the Chinese market. I mean, even under Carleton, we thought that we'd get more access, and in fact, our market share declined in those years. The problem is, or maybe the reality is that China is an integrated regime where all the elements work together, party, state, military, security, industrial, complex, and the party leads everything. We know, following the lead of the United States in recent years, that China is showing considerable influence in many domains: academia, domestic politics, economy, foreign policy, law enforcement, media, military, society, and technology. You know, this is something that Canada's worried about, and I'm also on the board of the Doublethink Lab in Taiwan that does quite a lot of work on this aspect. Finally, China will say that the solution is to seek common ground while reserving differences, although the differences that are to reserved are typically ours. The Chinese don't reserve any differences that I've ever heard of. You know, this principle has been articulated by China for a long time, since the Bandung Conference in 1955. But I think that if Europe wants to have these benefits of Chinese market access, then they have to be tolerant of Chinese espionage, influence operations, interference, bribery, and intimidation operations. They won't accept, you know, really resolving differences and seeking common ground. We'd have to terminate our principal position against the genocide against the Uyghurs, the betrayal of Hong Kong, including the bounties on pro-democracy advocates in exile in European countries, and the larger frame, China's violations of international law, its autocratic hostility towards democracy, and enabling strongman dictatorships around the world. Essentially, I mean, what we're looking at is that China has this dream to rule the world from Beijing, fulfilling its historic ambition to restore China to imperial domination of all under heaven, Tianxia, as the Chinese emperors of ancient times. They see this as preordained by the dialectics of international relations espoused by Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for the new era. But I think whatever we're looking at between the U.S. and China, we're seeing a severe challenge to Europe sustaining the liberal democratic principles of domestic governance and foreign relations in the years ahead. Thank you.
Are you all uplifted? Now we will have our far-right speaker bring optimism, I'm sure. So, no, please, joking aside. Kristen Hopewell, between Scylla and Charybdis, navigating EU strategic autonomy amid the U.S.-China trade war.
Great, thank you. And thanks very much for organizing this event and for the invitation to participate. This has been a really interesting and engaging set of discussions so far. So the paper I'm presenting today is part of a special issue that's looking at EU strategic autonomy amid growing US-China rivalry. And it's specifically focusing on internal binding efforts within the EU, as well as the external wedging strategies of the US and China. So my piece is looking specifically at the realm of trade. So as we well know now, the multilateral trading system is in the midst of a profound crisis. The WTO's negotiation function has broken down. Its enforcement mechanism has now been entirely disabled by the US. And the two dominant powers in the system, the US and China, are both blatantly violating its rules. So in the context of growing Sino-American competition, we would expect the US and China to each be trying to encourage Europe to align with it against the other. Rival powers are expected to deploy binding and wedging strategies to bring other states on side and deny them to their adversaries. So we would logically expect the US to attempt to try to get Europe to align with it on trade, a central area of its conflict with China. And we'd also expect for China to try to do the same. In the realm of trade, however, we've actually seen very little in the way of a coherent binding or wedging strategy from either the US or China. Instead, their behavior has been much less strategic and far more haphazard, volatile, and contradictory than rationalist theories of grand strategy and the concepts of wedging and binding would predict. So the US's binding strategies, its policies aimed at maintaining and enhancing the EU's loyalty, have been either non-existent under the Trump administration or extremely limited as under Biden. The US has repeatedly taken measures that, whether out of malice or neglect, harm European economic interests, and it's waged an assault on the rules-based trading order that the Europeans hold dear. So in trade, the US has really driven its own wedge into the Transatlantic alliance. Now, China could have sought to further weaken the EU's traditional alignment with the US and foster closer alignment with Europe, but instead has similarly damaged its relationship with Europe. So in the realm of trade, Washington and Beijing have both done a remarkably poor job of cultivating Europe's support. Indeed, driven primarily by domestic political considerations, their behavior has served more to alienate, antagonize, and repel Europe than encourage it to align with either of them. So external wedging by the US and China has been limited and largely unsuccessful. And in fact, external threats from the US and China have generally served to strengthen EU unity and its resolve to enable itself to act independently to defend its own interest. So external wedging efforts by the US and China have thus far failed to alter the EU's trade policy. Instead, the EU has managed to preserve a significant degree of strategic autonomy on trade, using internal binding strategies to overcome tensions and disagreements among its member states and to maintain sufficient cohesion to preserve an independent trade policy. So we see, rather than aligning with either the US or China, the EU has really charted its own course on trade, navigating threats from both sides. The EU has pursued a two-track approach, actively seeking first to preserve and defend the rules-based multilateral trading system and its enforcement, while also being willing, where necessary, to resort to raw power to enforce its trade interests. So it's thus pursued a system-preserving agenda in opposition to the revisionism of both the US and China. In contrast to their rampant rule-breaking, the EU has remained largely rule-abiding, emphasizing the need to maintain and uphold international trade rules. And it's tried wherever possible to work within the system to enforce its trade rights. But it's also developed new trade policy tools and instruments to better defend its interests in this new era of geoeconomic competition. So I don't think we need to spend too much time rehashing what the US has been up to in the realm of trade. I think we're all way too familiar with this at this point, with the chaos that the Trump administration in particular has unleashed on the global economy. But in big picture terms, basically since the first Trump administration, the US has abandoned its traditional support for the multilateral trading system, disregarding any commitment to free trade, multilateral cooperation, or respect for the rule of law. and instead embracing aggressive unilateralism and launching an assault on the rules-based trading order. And the EU and other traditional American allies have all been targets of the US's trade aggression. So wedge strategies are expected to be used by a state to divide its opponents. But instead, the Trump administration has deployed a confrontational approach of coercion and intimidation, not only against the US's perceived adversaries, such as China, but also against its closest allies, including the EU. Under Trump, the US has terrorized friends and foes alike, imposing tariffs and applying threats against all of the US's major trading partners. So Trump has made no effort to cultivate allies or to try to bind them more closely to the US. On the contrary, just the opposite. Since the first Trump administration, the US has been behaving as a rogue state in the multilateral trading system, posing a severe threat to the stability of that system and to the global economy more broadly. So Trump's heavy-handed and indiscriminate use of coercion, combined with his assault on multilateralism and the rule of law, have deeply alienated the EU and other US allies. So Trump has really driven a wedge into the US's core alliances, including with the EU. Now, this could have been a golden opportunity for China to try to propel a global realignment in its favor. With Trump driving a wedge into the US's relationships with even its closest allies, like the EU, this could have been an ideal moment for China to seek to draw those states closer to its own side. But instead, we've seen China do just the opposite. With its rising authoritarianism, its crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong, and widespread human rights violations, combined with its wolf warrior diplomacy, growing use of economic coercion, and increasing aggression towards its neighbors, both its domestic and its foreign policies have repelled many other states. Its recent behavior has profoundly changed how other countries see China, leading to a far more negative perception of Beijing worldwide, particularly in liberal democracies like the EU, with a growing sense of China as a hostile rising power and a threat in both economic and geopolitical terms. During the first Trump administration, China tried to present itself as stepping into the gap left by the US and assuming the mantle of leadership in defending free trade and the rules-based order. But such claims lacked credibility based on its actual behavior in the trading system. So China has made extensive use of protectionist trade policies, including things like heavy subsidies, import and export restrictions, discrimination against foreign firms, forced technology transfer, and violations of intellectual property rules, all of which are seen as a violation of the rules and principles of the WTO. China has also frequently been an obstructionist force in WTO negotiations and also been seen as manipulating weaknesses within the WTO's dispute system in order to violate the rules. In addition, there's also been growing concerns about China's increasing use of economic coercion, flagrantly disregarding the rule of law in trade by weaponizing trade as an instrument of economic coercion. In the case of Lithuania, the EU was mentioned on the earlier panel today. China's attempts to try to use economic coercion to bully Lithuania and the EU failed, but that has had lasting effects. Within the EU, China's economic coercion heightened perceptions that China is unreliable and untrustworthy as a trading partner, and gave further impetus for the EU to develop unilateral tools to protect itself from foreign trade aggression. So the EU has taken a very different path on trade than either the US or China. With the trading system under threat, the EU really took the lead in efforts to try to save the WTO, advancing concrete initiatives directed at salvaging the system. So first and foremost, the EU played the lead in launching the MPIA, the Multi-Party Interim Appeals Arbitration Arrangement, which is basically intended to replace the now defunct WTO appellate body, which effectively acts as a Supreme Court for global trade, and which the Trump administration and the Biden administration disabled. That left global trade rules effectively unenforceable, and so the EU has tried to step into the gap, creating this MPIA to replicate the functioning of the appellate body and ensure that global trade rules can in fact be enforced. So this has been a crucial effort in terms of trying to preserve a rules-based system in trade. The EU has also worked with the US and Japan on the trilateral initiative, an effort to try to create stricter rules on industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and forced technology transfer, all of which is very much directed at trying to rein in some of China's harmful trading practices. And the EU has also been a leader in forming bilateral and regional free trade agreements, both to promote rules-based trade, as well as to try to diversify its trading relationships and reduce its dependence and vulnerability vis-a-vis the US and China. So on the one hand, we've had the EU defending the existing system, and the EU has also sought to use existing tools provided by the system to defend its interests. So the EU, for example, launched 2 WTO disputes challenging China's use of economic coercion, as well as its intellectual property violations. And importantly here, the WTO dispute system is still potentially effective for challenging China's trade practices because China is actually a participant in that MPIA that I just mentioned. So China has agreed to continue to be bound by WTO rules, unlike the US, where there's no way to enforce WTO rules on the US at this point. In addition, the EU has also ramped up its use of existing trade defense tools, things like anti-dumping and countervailing duties, which are allowable under WTO rules, most recently with a major CVD investigation into Chinese EVs that resulted in the imposition of duties on those. And one of the key distinctions here is that, in contrast to the US, where the US just arbitrarily imposed massive tariffs on Chinese e-vehicles in order to block their coming into the US market, the EU took a rules-based, law-abiding approach, running a proper CVD investigation, finding China to be subsidizing its EVs, and then imposing countervailing duties in response. So a rules-based approach from the EU as opposed to the rule-violating approach from the US. So in addition to trying to preserve the system and using the existing tools provided by the system, the EU has also been developing new tools to better defend its trade interests against both the US and China. And it's done this in a number of different areas. One is a new trade enforcement regulation, which is intended to address that absence of a functional appellate body, an enforcement mechanism at the WTO. This new trade enforcement regulation enables the EU to impose countermeasures if a state appeals into the void. Basically, without a functioning appellate body, any country that loses a dispute at the WTO can block the ruling by appealing to the void created by the now defunct appellate body. So if a state were to do that against the EU now has a mechanism enabling it to impose countermeasures if a country blocks a ruling at the WTO. It's also created an anti-coercion instrument, which enables the deployment of countermeasures in response to economic coercion. This was originally developed in order to address China, but is now probably most likely to be used against the US. It's also created a new foreign subsidies regulation intended to prevent foreign firms from gaining an unfair advantage in mergers and acquisitions or government procurement contracts through subsidies, and also created an international procurement instrument intended to try to ensure a level playing field for government procurement. And it's done other things in the areas of investment and export controls. Oops. There we go. So to wrap up, the EU has demonstrated considerable strategic autonomy amid rising trade conflict. It's sought to cooperate with both the US and China where possible, but it's also been willing to challenge behavior that threatens the multilateral trading system or its trade interests. The EU has led efforts to try to preserve and defend the rules-based trading order amid the twin threats stemming from the US and China. The EU is thus approaching the system in a fundamentally different way than either the US or China. Ironically, with their heavily state interventionist policies, their rampant rule violation, and growing trade aggression, the US and China have actually become increasingly like one another. So in this context, the EU stands out for its commitment to maintaining a relatively open global trading system based on the rule of law, with 2 of the 3 dominant states in the multilateral trading system blatantly violating its rules. The EU has really been unique amongst the major powers in seeking to preserve and defend a rules-based liberal trading order. At the same time, though, it's certainly not a pushover. The EU has also strengthened its trade defenses with the creation of a variety of new trade policy instruments and tools to enable it to better defend itself against both China and the US. So I'll wrap up there and look forward to our discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kristen. So this was more hopeful in a way, right? The EU is standing strong, and fighting against alienation. So I told you, the far right has optimistic views. No, that's a joke. Sorry. Okay, let's not abuse too much this bad joke. So last presentation by Min Yi from Boston University, who is online. Do we have Min Yi online? Yes, there you are. Nice to have you with us. She will be speaking on the topic of aligning or balancing China's reactive approach to relations in Europe. So I guess sounds like a great complement to Kristen's presentation. So Minye, please.
Yeah, I want to thank the colleagues at the Carleton College for organizing this really timely conference. I feel very sorry not to be able to attend in person because from the speakers and the panels, it would. We will have very good, productive conversation in person, but we do also have the technology and geopolitics that allow us to meet online. So here is both a sorry, but also thank you to the organizers for making this happen. I do see that my prepared presentation complements with the other panelists, which I was a little bit concerned on my own part, but I was asked to do a presentation on China's strategic choices in the shifting world order. And I decided to go historical. And it turns out I think the historical can complement with other panelists. So basically, my argument on China's policy or strategic policies toward European relations are pragmatic and optimistic, reactive to the kinds of structural dynamics going on in the Western bloc and how that's interacting with China's strategic choices on its own. May I move to the second slide, please? Okay, so here the historical slides is the from balancing to aligning. So my understanding of the Chinese historical or more than 100 years interaction with Europe really has been swinging between aligning and balancing. And they take relatively long-term views, positioning versus European relations. One caveat is China's strategic interactions with European relations are rather different from its relations with Asia or with America. So the European relations allow China to be more flexible, but also to play the geopolitical strategy with a lot more long-term vision. So here, my historical accounts start with the declining China. Right? So the imperial China was in decline, lost its dominance in the 1840s, and then afterwards, the Chinese was actually pretty strategic and clever in utilizing balancing to achieve its partial independence. So the Chinese proactively invited all major Western powers to be invested in modernization efforts in the country. So that's where by the end of 1800s, the Chinese territory was a sphere influence, although it would be seen as like embodiment of humiliation. But on the other hand, I think it's also embodiment of a successful geopolitical playing by the Chinese ruling elites all the time. So they were benefiting and they were strategically utilizing the balancing. And now on the right, this image was a picture of the legendary diplomat from China attending the peace conference in Paris in 1918, Gu Weijun. Right, so when the World War I ended, Chinese government was on the victor side. So Gu Weijun, representing China, had major hope for receiving some kind of concession back from German territories in China. While being at the conference, Gu Weijun, from his diary and from the reporting, it showed he was like extremely disappointed that no major powers supported China's legitimate demands at the Paris conference, and instead the Chinese territory was conceded to more powerful Japan. And so this events, as well known by historians or even general public, right? This event sparked the powerful May 4th movement in China. But Gu Weijun left lasting legacy to Chinese international relations experts and intellectual thinking. That is, weak powers do not have diplomacy, and the multi-national balancing actually has a lot of limits to achieving China's goal. Next slides, please. And so this historical experience played into the choices of the communist China in the late 40s and the 1950s. And so this time the Chinese opted for alignment. And so they signed this very comprehensive alliance relationship with Soviet Union. And also adopted a rather drastic, one-sided policy in cutting all its ties with capitalist West. And so by doing this aligning, in retrospect, that strategy also paid off. The Warsaw Pact, led by Soviet, really provided important assistance to industrialize, to improve the technology and weaponry systems for the new China. So aligning worked to ensure the new PRC's survival. But then China learned a harsh lesson again. Right? The big powers could become predatory rather quickly, and Soviet and China had large, long territorial disputes. So yes, and the ideological breakdown was a part of this phenomenon as well. So in short, this Cold War lesson for the PRC was that the leaning one side or alliance relationship actually is very, very unpredictable. And so that laid the groundwork for going back to balancing, and the U.S.-China began to get together, and China actively, again, going back to the balancing strategy, establishing ties with all major capitalist countries, including Europe, Western Europe, but also in Japan and other Asian democracies too. Next slides. Okay, so the balancing strategy lasted from the 80s largely to the early 2000s. Right? And so the map on the left is a Indo-Pacific region, and the plus European Union policies, as in a U.S.-led two coalitions, Pacific coalitions and European Atlantic coalitions, in a coordinated restriction or constriction of China's regional and global ambitions. And here the Chinese tried to drive wedges, but as my co-panelist mentioned, there's just a lot of limitation, and the wedging strategy didn't work. And so they eventually looking at this map and decided that the aligning with Russia would be important for breaking these Atlantic and Pacific coalitions against China. And in this mix, the Belt and Road Initiative really developed rather quickly, and with Russia playing a bigger role. Next slides, please. So now we are coming back to a new era in the Trump 2. Are we back to the future? This is the question. I can see from the Chinese perspective, and then you do have the opening for new balancing. Given that the U.S. relationship with Europe is very difficult. And Europeans are looking for alternatives. Canada is looking for alternatives. So the Chinese would see this as opening, but there's a lot of uncertainties as well. Next slide, please. So I don't think the Chinese are making drastic shift for new balancing. So new balancing is being pursued more proactively, but that's because the Chinese see the global competition with the U.S. as the main strategic focus, and so anything that will help China on this competition is much more acceptable and welcome. But on the other hand, the Chinese strategic focus is in Indo-Pacific countries, the region. So that's where I say China's strategy toward European relations, seeing Europe as different types of relationship that China can build, China has this enough distance to wait around and to seize the moments and to rearrange its strategic choices. But its main focus is in the Indo-Pacific region, and that's where it has to play much more complex geopolitical and geoeconomic relations. So in other words, China's relationship with Europe will be in the degree of flexible balancing and aligning to the moments of change. And then lastly, China can play, but it's not central, but can play an influential economic and geopolitical force to Europe. There's a limitation also, Europe is to what extent Europe will be willing to play this balancing game with China vis-a-vis America. And to what extent Russia can develop normal relationship with the U.S. And so this will decide the following ongoing a few years. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Minnie. I guess we have some time for questions. Are we supposed to finish at 12:30 sharp, or can we take a bit more time if necessary? Okay, excellent. We do have some flexibility. Are there questions? Lady over there, microphone. If you can please, yeah.
Hi. Can you hear me? Is
Yes.
this working? I have a question for Jeremy Peltel, but also for all of the panelists. I thought I thought I heard you say that the Chinese were advocating a rules-based international order. That's the case. That's interesting. I assume that you mean in the economic sphere, not in the political sphere, right?
No, I mean, China is a staunch defender of the UN system. Even when the way in which China violates WTO rules is not like formally violating them like the United States does, and even its countervailing things have normally been done through WTO rules. So at the economic level, China supports it. It supports the UN system. It doesn't subscribe to liberal universality, but it doesn't. But in terms of global institutions, it subscribes to all of them. It's the biggest contributor of peacekeeping forces among the permanent members of the Security Council. So it has increased dramatically. It's the proportion of the UN budget that it supports. It's still a member of the World Bank and the IMF. So if you're talking about all of the post-war institutions, China is a staunch supporter of them. I mean, what it doesn't subscribe to is liberalism. And if you look at the Chinese speeches, Wang Yi always talks about true multilateralism. What is true multilateralism? True multilateralism doesn't mean NATO. It means not alliance systems, and it means something like actually what China likes about kind of multilateralism is Asian-style multilateralism of consensus rather than majoritarianism. That's what it likes the Security Council because it has a veto there. Consensus multilateralism means you have a veto, because China doesn't like the small numerical majority. There are more reasons than one why China doesn't like majoritarianism. And it's not simply, it's because from a Chinese kind of ethical point of view, majoritarianism means that sometimes you have to go against your friends on something. And that's uncomfortable. And it means you exclude people. So exclusionary cooperative behavior is uncomfortable in the Chinese cultural context. So even though you can say there's pragmatic reasons why it doesn't like those majoritarian systems, there are also kind of cultural reasons why it doesn't like it. It means that sometimes you have to, and so they avoid doing it. You know, for a long time, China invented something at the UN Security Council, where the question was, China didn't put a veto use a veto at the Security Council for many, many years. And when a time came for things it didn't want to support, it simply didn't show up to vote. So this is an example of how this is in some ways cultural. So we have to. So China does look at rules rather differently. And it doesn't like multilateral, but it does like the international institutions. It does try to forge them to its advantage, and it has changed the UN Human Rights Council in ways which have favored it, and has invented all kinds of things that helped it. For example, take no action, which is to say, you hear a report of human rights violation, and you actually have a vote in the UN Council which says we won't take any action on it. So these kinds of things it subverts them, if you like, in its own way, but it doesn't oppose them.
Right. Okay, thank you for this, Jeremy. Maybe just, I don't know, since the question was also addressed to other members of the panel, if anyone would like to either comment on what Jeremy said or on the question, or do you want, just wait for the microphone, please, so the people online can.
Yeah, because what I heard you say is that China wasn't a revisionist power. And what I heard you say was that China was a revisionist state in terms of its dealings with the WTO. So I wonder.
Kristen?
Yeah, I'd be a bit more skeptical about China's adherence to WTO rules, I think, than Jeremy. I think if you look at things like China's use of economic coercion, blatant violation of WTO rules, the way that China uses anti-dumping investigations as retaliation blatant violation of WTO rules. The way that it's manipulated the system, where it will break the rules until there's a case taken against it. Finally, there's a ruling against it, then it will comply, but by then the damage has already been done. I don't think China's quite so rule-abiding as it would like us to believe.
It gets formally rule-abiding, not...
Even there's clearly many instances of blatant rule violation from China.
I don't like the rules, but I don't oppose the system. Okay, fair enough. Minye, would you like to comment on this discussion?
Yeah, the Chinese like to have a procedure, and so you have a system that's where interest can be processed, interaction can be changed. I think to the Chinese strategic thinking, having multilateral settings with a set of rules facilitates the processing interaction that helps China achieve its goal. So I usually don't think of this binary terms like rule binding or rule violating. That's not in the strategic dialogues in China. So whether it's due to culture or due to its strategic learning from the history, China has both a strong cynicism about rules, but also really likes to have those multilateral settings that they can really interact with other parties on an equal footing.
Yeah.
Let me just say one thing about this.
Yes, sorry.
China's participation in the UN has been, to a large extent, to undermine the principles of the UN Charter, the Declaration of Human Rights, and the Convention Against Torture. So we do see a lot of insertion of Chinese language into critical UN documents, including the Community of the Common Destiny of Mankind, and the placing of Chinese officials in key positions in the UN who appear to be more an outpost of the Chinese Foreign Ministry than international diplomats. I mean, one glaring example would be China's abuse of the Interpol red notice system for political purposes, and then the sudden removal of the head of Interpol by China for reasons unclear. There's just a lot going on there that suggests that China is not a supporter of the fundamental basis for these institutions, but seeks to bring them round to better serve Chinese interests. It's really about might makes right more than an international rules-based order.
Okay, thank you. You had a question, right?
Thank you for an excellent panel. My question is to Kristen. There's nothing more wonderful for a European who just flew in to hear that we're actually getting some things right. So thank you for that. But my question is a future-oriented one. So you gave this assessment that the EU's path has been able to survive the trade situation, defending the system for the most part, largely. And now we're having this debate on OSA, Open Strategic Autonomy, in the EU. And the documents as they stand, they do include research security and economic security. But what they don't really include is what strategic autonomy is all about at the end of the day is defense. So the white paper that somebody quoted today already on for European defense says that Europe must do far more to restore credible deterrence and deliver the security on which our prosperity depends. So my question to you, coming from, and I hear that a lot from the defense people, but given your economic expertise, I wonder how much can the EU, in your opinion, do with purely trade instruments, something that we've been doing so far and apparently well, without a collective defense aspect of the open strategic autonomy. And whatever you say, I will include it in my notes, but either quote or not, but that's up to you, but it's really valuable for our research. Thank you.
Thank you. Kristen?
Well, I think, so trade is sort of a unique area for the EU in the sense that this is an area where, because of the structure and the nature of the EU, it's predisposed to have a high degree of strategic autonomy on trade because the EU has always spoken with a common voice on trade. And through a variety of strategies over the past several years, it's been able, for the large part, to avoid potential tensions, different interests amongst its member states from coming to the fore and, severely disrupting the course of EU trade policy. So trade, because it's always been an EU competency, is sort of unique. And I think in terms of your question, how much can the EU do solely with trade instruments? Clearly, there are limits, right? This is an area where the EU is a major power. It's on par with the US and China in terms of its economic might by far. In the realm of defense, though, clearly this is an area where it's a significant laggard. And trade instruments alone will not ensure collective defense of the EU, collective security of the EU. So, there are limits to trade.
Yeah. Jeremy, you want to add to that?
Look, the answer, I think, is we are now in 1938, and rearmament is going to be the agenda for Europe, for Canada, and because it's not simply for security reasons, but because in an era of declining trade, and trade is in one area in which national and local budgets can reflate an economy without resorting to trade, so that we will be reflating our economies through rearmament. Now, what that will lead to in a few years' time, I don't know. But the EU is already doing it. Canada is pledged to do it. We will see this happening in more and more places as trade gets replaced by other forms of investment.
Okay. I have Randy, then I have Akim, then I have Anton. So, Randy, please.
Okay, thanks. These are two really good panels, the first one as well, and this one, thank you very much. I guess my question is for anyone who wants to pick it up, and it's in a world of kind of intensifying economic, partially competition, but also go at your own. My question is really about the sustainability of China's economic model in a world of constricted globalization and underconsumption, on massive terms and I'm just wondering, and I would love to hear any of the panelists' thoughts on how China can navigate this world with its existing economic model, which seems to me to be a little bit unsustainable. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Randy. Maybe before we go to the panel, we'll take a few more questions. So there's Randy's question on how China can sustain its economic path, and now Akim, and then I will go back to Anton.
Yeah, just very quickly, it's a question for Kristen. Kristen, you mentioned the EU's instruments that are obviously designed to defend its interests, but also to signal its adherence to the multilateral trading system. But I wonder if in the current situation, these instruments will actually be used, applied, followed as written, or if we are not already seeing the EU strategically compromising on the use of its own instruments because it's necessary to strike deals with two of its biggest trading partners, the US and China.
Okay. Thank you, Achim. Anton?
Okay, so thanks for the panel. It was obviously very gloomy, and I even found Kristen's presentation rather gloomy. So I do have let me try to throw a wrench into things a little bit and be a little bit contrarian here, and my question is mostly directed at Chris. It is a question mostly directed at Kristen, but anyone can take a stab at it. So we've heard a lot about rules-based related things, so is China revisionist on rules? Is it not revisionist on rules? So I'd like to take a step back and because if we're talking about a new trade bargain, and everyone's basically only talking about advanced economies, no one's even mentioned how most of the world looks at this situation. So let me advocate for that side of the world. So the rules we're talking about, basically the enforcement and expansion of maximalist intellectual property rules. Sitting here in Canada, it was a bit of a relief when the U.S., geopolitically, I guess not, but in terms of our prosperity, it was kind of a relief seeing the U.S. not push strong pharma and other sorts of maximalist IP rules at CPTPP, right? So when we're talking about China not obeying these rules, what kind of intellectual property rules are we actually talking about? China is in fact, there is some very, in some ways, China resembles the United States in how aggressively it commercializes and wants to sell its own technology. On the other hand, we're seeing a lot of things like open source, which surprised me when I got to China because I thought China was going maximalist IP. Then I got there in 2020, and no, actually, open source is huge, right? So this is something that we do have to think about when we're talking about let's have a rules-based system. What kind of rules-based system? Where is it that like China doesn't obey the rules, right? But China disagrees with the interpretation of the rules, right? So this goes back to forced technology transfers, right? So forced technology transfers. Okay. Are these things forbidden by the WTO, right? If you use an MFN principle, 25% or 50% auto tariff, but if you come here and you source from us, and most importantly, you teach us how to make cars, that's okay, right? Then you can come and do business here. If you're Europe or Canada today, isn't that a good model to have? Like, if you're not happy that the Chinese own advanced technology that you can't catch up, well, have them come here and give it to us, just like they did to us. So everyone's seeing no compromise. But I'm usually very pessimistic on these things, but I refuse to see that, like, okay, this is the end and it's just going to be war. Let's just slow down and bring other parties into it, because not everybody will agree to what the rules are, and there is I just want Kristen, like, maybe clarify a little bit about what kind of rules are we talking about in terms of the WTO. Do you think it's possible do you think that we when we're talking about China being revisionist, are they actually being revisionist towards the system, or do they want the rules to reflect more of their views on how global trade should be? In other ways, that if it's the second, that the WTO is salvageable, and if they're revisionist to the point where they're just taking advantage of it, which is another argument, that's the argument a lot of people have made, that's fine, then the WTO is not salvageable. So is it salvageable or not?
All right. Thank you, Anton, for this comment and long question. All right. Since Kristen has been engaged by the last three questions, I guess I will start with her. So.
Thanks for a set of fantastic questions. Randy's question about the sustainability of China's economic model that's so export focused in an era where we meant maybe moving towards deglobalization. That's a great question. So far we're seeing deglobalization has been extraordinarily limited, right? So I think we need to be careful about distinguishing the present moment from where we may go in future. At the moment, even in the U.S., we've seen Trump have to reverse many of his tariffs, right? So it's not clear how far we will go in terms of the path towards deglobalization. But I would say one thing that we're seeing is because the U.S. has disabled the WTO appellate body and WTO rules are no longer enforceable, the rise of economic nationalism and protectionism is spreading well beyond the U.S. And you have a whole host of other countries that are now violating WTO rules with impunity because they know that there's no appellate body to rein them in and enforce the rules. And we're seeing a host of other countries starting to potentially take measures against China, and China's exports are threatening to do so. So Indonesia, for example, threatening a 200% tariff on Chinese goods, very much mimicking Trump, right? Trump's policies. So the question is, in the absence of WTO rule enforcement, how widely this protectionist forces will spread and whether we are going to see the unraveling of the rules-based trading system and the unraveling of trade. We are going to see economic disintegration and deglobalization well beyond the U.S. And so that's when clearly that would have huge implications for China's model. In terms of EU instruments, I'd be curious to talk more with you and get more of a sense of what you're thinking of specifically about how it might strategically compromise on some of these new tools that it's developing. But I think one thing that these tools do is they give the EU new forms of leverage, which will ultimately strengthen its negotiating position vis-a-vis the U.S. or China. So they have value. Even if the EU were to compromise, it carries a strong stick now, and that gives it leverage in negotiations. in terms of China, whether it's revisionist or not in the training system, this is a huge debate, and we could talk at much greater length about this. But I think, we talked about China's rule violation. Another piece of this, too, is that China has played a highly obstructionist role in WTO negotiations, particularly over the past decade or so. It's interesting.
Obstructionist in India.
Well, India more recently, but before India, China was a highly obstructionist force in WTO negotiations, which in a sense, China has sort of created a bit of the situation that we find ourselves in now. There were efforts at the WTO to create these stronger rules to better address China's economic model and rein in some of its trade practices. There have also been efforts to negotiate agreements in a whole range of areas, things like agriculture, things like fishery subsidies, defining what is a developing country within the WTO. Many of these areas are of critical importance to developing countries, to the global south, and China has consistently blocked new rules in these areas. And these were areas where the U.S. was willing to go along. The whole world was ready to agree, and China was the sole actor blocking agreement. So, it's China sort of gumming up the WTO negotiating process also led us to the current situation where we're in, where you have the U.S. saying, well, we can't reform, we can't move things forward to the WTO. So this is part of why the U.S. has gone in such a revisionist direction itself. So I think that obstruction is something that's an important part of the China story, too.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kristen. I'll go to Min first if she wants to answer some of the questions or wants to add to what Kristen said or contradict what Kristen said so far. Min?
Yeah. Just a sec. Can you guys? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So maybe I'll just take the China model question. One thing is in terms of China's behavior globally and whether China is responsible or it's reactive. I think that it's just two sides of the same coin. It depends on where you are sitting. You'll observe China being both assertive and reactive, being obstructionist and also reinforcing. And so I agree with the conversation ongoing. But I feel like what's missing here is the understanding of the Chinese economic model. It's not static, and we don't have enough coverage or investigation of how China's economic transition happened during the COVID. As a long-term observer of China's industrialization, I was surprised at how much change that was taking place since the COVID 4 years. China was not this big exporter in 2019, and it became such strong exporter since the outbreak of COVID. And three things. One is really automation. The Chinese, since they faced the COVID, they seized the COVID lockdown or forced by the COVID lockdown, and also forced by the export control from America and Europe. The automation, domestic production, digitalization in China has just accelerated to unbelievable scale and speed. And that's not very good for China either, because they are churning out these really cost-effective manufactured goods, but without employing more people and driving up the consumption of the domestic population. So they are struggling with the kinds of industrial transition that they didn't intended. The second is the Chinese trade with non-America, non-European partners have increased much faster. And so the ASEAN actually is the largest export market for China. Again, not very beneficial to China, because most of Chinese workers, they don't get to participate in this miracle. So one thing, again, I'm a positive thinker. So one thing I think, hopefully the silver lining of this trade war is China finally get this crisis it needed to really stimulate domestic consumption. And so what's going on in China are two-pronged strategy. In Europe, I say it's a new balancing, but within China, it's really trying to shifting its economic model from production more to consumption, and the other is try to develop much deeper multi-pronged economic relationship with the region. So we can see, other than being this export-import dynamic, there will be a lot more education, technology, green transition, those collaboration going on between China and the region and the broader global South. So I would urge you, colleagues at the conference, don't see the Chinese model as a static one, and also see what's going on in the country and in the region. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Jeremy, you seem insistent.
Well, first, I just first to say that short selling China on China's economic collapse has not been a successful venture over the last quarter century at least, and there have been those. So, and so I echo Minya's point is that China is able to adjust. There are ways it can adjust, which even within its Marxist prejudices, right? The emphasis on production and de-emphasis on consumption, the prejudice against the private sector. First of all, Xi Jinping woke up and recognized the private sector when DeepSeek emerged at the beginning of the year. And suddenly, okay, the private sector, we want the private sector. We love the private sector. We love you so much, we'll hug you to death. So now the question then becomes on consumption. One thing that I've seen in the literature that they could do that would stimulate consumption was to buy up local real estate, to nationalize local real estate nationally. And that would release a lot of money available for local spending without actually changing the economic model and putting money directly in the hands of consumers, which, as Marxists, he doesn't like to do. So there are ways that they actually can finesse these things. And what we've seen under Xi Jinping is that he does make decisive moves when push comes to shove. So I'm not necessarily, I don't know whether you call me a pessimist or an optimist. I think they can adjust to that sort of thing. What's unsustainable is the political model. Xi Jinping is going to die one day. He's going to get sick one day. And there's no number 2, there's no number 3, there's no number 4, and there's no number 5 in the Chinese regime today. So we have a system which is politically unsustainable. And that, I think, it may be as big a danger as the economic instability. Okay.
Charles, last words.
I find myself agreeing with Jeremy, which is almost unprecedented. I was on a TV panel a while ago with Jeremy's friend Wenran Jiang, an American called Gordon Chang. Gordon Chang was introduced as the author of The Coming Collapse of China. The thing is that Gordon wrote that book in 2001. So Wenran made a point, which I had to agree with, which is, didn't Gordon think it was time for a new edition? But in terms of what's the future of China? Can they sustain? I've recently finished reading Kevin Rudd's book based on his PhD thesis, 640 pages, which he wrote part-time while he was heading up the Asia Foundation and various other things. And he basically says that Xi Jinping's policy is to go to the left to more Leninism in economics and go to the right and more nationalism in international affairs. I'm not sure that this is sustainable. And if Mr. Xi does go to see Marx, or if he is arrested, the successor regime to this regime may not be one that we like in terms of being democratic polity, responsible stakeholder in global affairs, but could really be quite a right-wing fascistic military government that might make us feel positively nostalgic for the good old days of Hu Jintao. So, the situation is uncertain, and the front factor continues to bedevil all of us. So, I hope the more optimistic perspective is correct. I hope it is. I just find it hard to support.
Okay, well, here's hoping. Let's hope that even politically, China will be able to adapt in some form.
I want to make
one be catastrophic.
Very short point.
Yes, Jeremy.
Cheating is not revisionism. Revisionism means having an alternative normative system. And on this question, I will cite to you my colleague and alma mater, my former boss, at Tsinghua University, Yan Xuetung, who's known as a hardliner. And when I asked him earlier this year, well, does this give China a chance for normative leadership worldwide? He says they're incapable of doing it. This is from a leading Chinese IR scholar who's known as more of a hardliner. He says, we are incapable of exercising normative leadership.
Okay. I guess we'll end here on that note. So thank you so much to our 4 panelists. I think this was a very lively discussion as well as great presentations. So thank you very much. And now I guess I can invite you to lunch, except for those online, unfortunately. But thank you very much.